pleasure to be here, and I just hope that as we go through the presentation that you'll feel free to ask questions whenever you'd like, and because that's what we want to do, is to answer your questions about the Genesis flood. Do any of you right now have a picture? What comes to mind when you think about the flood? Any thoughts on that?
Water.
A lot of water, right. What else? Sorry?
Total destruction.
Total destruction, okay. Anything else?
The ark.
The ark, right.
A selected few survivors.
Yep, just a few survivors. Anything else?
You don't need to give your talk now. They've got it all.
Okay, most people usually think of maybe just rain coming down gently and then the ark being lifted up. And I think today you'll probably get a little different picture of what the flood was like. It wasn't a gentle event, as most of us think it was. It was very catastrophic and very destructive. So those are some of the questions that we want to answer today. And please, as we go through, if we're not, if I'm not making it clear, or if you have questions, please just go ahead and interrupt me. So I want to answer your questions. Okay, first of all, why do we study the flood? Well, the flood, first of all, occupies a very prominent position in our Bible. Next to creation, it has even more chapters devoted to it in the Bible than creation. And next to creation, the flood of Noah's time is the greatest event in the history of our physical earth. Now we know that obviously Jesus' death and resurrection is the greatest event in our spiritual life. But in the physical life of our earth, it basically was destroyed and recreated. So the Bible devotes 4 chapters to it, and Jesus and the New Testament apostles refer to it numerous times in the Bible, in the New Testament. And they treat it as a warning example of God's wrath and as a preview of what will happen in the final judgment. Now this flood, or the Bible also, when it speaks to science or history, it's very accurate. Primarily, it's a book to tell us about the gospel, about God sending his son to save us from our sins. But it also provides a lot of answers in science. For example, you see up here a picture of many rock layers laying right on top of each other. The Bible provides an explanation of that in the flood. And here we see fossils, and we find fossils all over the world. Again, the flood provides an explanation of those fossils. And it's a picture as well of the catastrophic destruction. We're going to talk about that. And it's a picture of the final judgment. In Matthew 24:37, it says, "As in the days of Noah, so shall it also be also shall be the coming of the Son of Man." That's worded really weird, isn't it? Every time I say that, I kind of stumble over it, but we get the meaning. We also want to study the flood so that we're able to defend our faith. Our world is becoming less and less Christian, and so not only do we need to know what we believe, but we need to understand why we believe it, so that when people question our faith, we can explain to them why we believe it. So that's also an important reason. And it also provides significant evidence about the age of the earth. Now we'll see in a little bit why that's important. When you think about, well, what difference does it make how old the earth is? Well, it makes a big difference. And as we go through the presentation, we'll try to cover that, and I'll explain what the difference is and why that's so important. So let's start by thinking about the pre-flood world. And we have a lot of misconceptions about the pre-flood world based upon what we've been taught in school and what we've grown up to think about, right? Is this what you think about when you see the pre-flood world? Just a few people, and those people kind of look like apes, don't they? They look like they came from apes. And then maybe not very intelligent, they lived in caves, they didn't have very good tools, and maybe located in just a small area, not very many people on the earth. And how about this? That looks more like Fred Flintstone and Adam and Eve, doesn't it? That's kind of what we think of when we think of this pre-flood world as being really primitive. Well, it actually was quite different than that. If we read Genesis 4 and 5, it gives us an idea about the pre-flood world. And actually, it's the only record that we have of what the pre-flood world was like. They built cities. You can see a picture of a city up here. Do you think of pre-flood people as being able to build cities? Usually we don't. They mined for metals. So they dug into the ground for metals, and they crafted things from iron and bronze. So that means they were able to melt metals, mix them together, form them. They developed music. The Bible specifically refers to people playing harps and flutes. They wrote poetry. Find some poetry in Genesis 4. They bred livestock, they tilled the soil, and they kept records, and they passed down the information. Now, we don't know for sure if they had written records, but they definitely passed down oral records. They may have had written records, too, that they were able to keep on the ark. We don't know for sure, but as you go through Genesis, you see various genealogies, various histories of families. And those are called toledos, and they mean history or genealogy. Usually they mean written history, but we don't know for sure at this point if they had a written language or not. They were certainly intelligent enough to. Most of the people lived to be about 900 years old, according to Genesis 5. How would you like to live to be 900 years old? I don't think I would. Living in sin for 900 years would get really, really old, wouldn't it? So this is the genealogy from Genesis 5. There are two genealogies in the Bible that are kind of special because they are not only genealogies, they talk about who fathered who and so on down the line, but they also give us numbers. So in this first column here, you see how old the patriarch was, how many years he lived. And in the second column, you see how old he was when he had his son. So for example, Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And in the third column, you see the remaining years of his life. So, for example, the Bible says Adam lived 930 years. He had Seth at 130 years. And then he lived another 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters, and he died. Right? And as you go down Genesis 5, every one of these says, and he died, and he died, and he died. Except for one. Anybody know which one? Enoch. Enoch is one of the two people who did not die in the Bible. God took him. So Enoch ruins the average lifespan of the people prior to the flood. So if we add the ages of the patriarchs when they had their son, if we add those up, and we know that Noah was 600 in the year of the flood because the Bible tells us that, we get a total of 1,656 years from creation to the flood. So these people lived 900 years approximately, and we had 1,656 years of history here. So they would have had a lot of time to, number one, have children, and number two, to learn things and to develop techniques, to develop technology as we do today. So I think our concept of the pre-flood world may be, quite a bit in error. They may have had a lot more technology than we thought they had. How many people might there have been at the time of the flood? If we look at this chart, we look at today's growth rate is about 1.13%, and the highest it ever was 2.0% in the 1960s. The current population of our world is 7.8 million. Billion, sorry, thank you. So if we look at that and say maybe they grew at the same rate that we're growing at today, then that would put them somewhere between line 1 and line 2, probably conservatively around 400 million people at the time of the flood. Now, if they grew at a higher rate, and they could have, because obviously they lived longer, they had more children. So if they grew at a higher rate, then potentially we could have had as many people on Earth at the time of the flood as there are currently today, 7 to 8 billion. We just don't think of it that way, do we? We think of maybe a few people died in the flood, but there were at least millions and perhaps billions of people who died in the flood. We also see in Genesis 3 the origin of sin. Adam and Eve sinned and they brought judgment on themselves and upon all creation. And we see in Genesis 4 that the world became more and more evil with each generation. And we see again the first murder. Cain kills Abel, and I think there are other murders also in Genesis 4. And there's polygamy. So the sin is starting to build as people are after the fall, right? So finally, God is fed up, right? And he says, and the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created, from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. So what does this tell us about how God feels about sin? He doesn't like sin very much, does he? He really doesn't. And so he was willing to destroy millions of people because they wouldn't listen and they wouldn't repent. So it really is a picture of what will happen someday to our world. But even in his well-deserved anger about sin, God showed his grace to and through a man named Noah. Noah was a believer. He was the righteous man, the Bible tells us. So God allowed 120 years. During that time, Noah preached. 2 Peter says he was a preacher of righteousness, so he preached about righteousness and repentance. And he also built the ark during that period of time. Of course, he had a few other things to do, too. He had 3 sons to raise, right? And he had to gather all that food to put on the ark and think about, do all the planning for what was going to go on the ark. God gave him a few instructions. He told him, build an ark. So what is an ark? The Bible only uses the word ark on 2 occasions. It uses it for the ark that was built at the flood, and it also uses it in one other place. Can anybody guess where that might be?
Ark of the Covenant.
No, it's not the Ark of the Covenant. That's what I thought it would be too. But the Ark of the Covenant uses a different Hebrew word. The other ark that uses the same Hebrew word is the basket that Moses was placed in when he was placed in the water. I thought that was kind of interesting.
The basket.
God told Noah, build it out of gopher wood. What's gopher wood? Do we have any gopher trees around here? I don't think so. Well, we don't know for sure, because the Bible doesn't tell us. But we think that maybe that was something like plywood, where they actually put together multiple layers of wood that were glued together, because that would make it quite a bit stronger than just regular wood. But again, that's speculation from some of our scientists. He told Noah to make rooms or enclosures in it for the animals. He told Noah to also cover it inside and outside with pitch. Let's think about that one a little bit. Where does pitch come from? Does anybody know?
Tar, oil sources.
Yeah, oil, coal, tar. You think there was any coal in the pre-flood world? Probably not, because where does coal come from? Coal comes from dead plants and animals that have been compressed. It's formed into coal. Well, there is another place that you can get pitch, and that's from when you heat wood. And actually, before the coal and oil industry got going, that's how we used to make pitch, is by heating or distilling wood products. So that's probably where they got the pitch. He also told him how big to make it. He said make it 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And then finish it 1 cubit from the top. And that may be a reference to an opening or a window on the top. So if you were going to live for a year in the ark with all these animals, you probably want a window, right? I think so. I would, definitely. He also said set a door in the side of the ark, make it with 3 levels or decks, and take every sort of food with you and store it up. Now this is kind of an important point, because God's telling Noah, okay, you're going to have to take care of the animals. You're going to have to feed them. You're going to have to make sure that you can get rid of the waste. You're going to have to make sure that they have proper air to breathe. Some people like to say that, well, maybe God put Noah and the animals to sleep for that year. Maybe they were in some kind of a trance so they could survive the flood. The Bible doesn't give any indication of that. And I think this statement by God saying, make sure you prepare the food, that's definitely an indication that, hey, you're going to take care of the animals through the flood. Has anybody ever been to the Ark Encounter in northern Kentucky? Yeah. Okay, this is an amazing replica of the Ark. And Answers in Genesis tried to stay as true as they possibly could to the commands that God had given Noah. Obviously, they didn't know what gopher wood was, but they used God's instructions to Noah, and then they went out And they looked at shipbuilding techniques that the ancient people used to use, like the Romans. And that's how they decided how to build this ship. There's something called mortise and tendon, which makes it stronger. There's also something where you have I'm trying to think what the name of it was now, but you have a peg and you have a hole in the board, and so you use those pegs and holes to connect the boards. And that makes it stronger. And actually, when it gets in the water, those pegs swell up, and it actually makes it more watertight than, if you didn't have anything there. So there were a lot of techniques that the ancient shipbuilders had that could have been used to build this ship. It was undoubtedly the largest ship ever built at that time. And it was actually the largest ship ever built until well into the 1900s. That's how impressive the ark was. So here's one of the questions that we get a lot. How did all the animals get to the ark? Well, the Bible does give us an answer for this one. God says, of the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing on the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. So Noah didn't have to go out after the animals, did he? They came to him to be loaded on the ark. Another question that's often asked is, how big was the ark? Which one's the real ark here? On the bottom. We see this a lot, and we think the 2 on the top are very cute. We have one of these out in the hallway, and they're great stories for kids. The problem is that sometimes they can cause an issue because they make the flood seem like a story instead of a real historical event. So as you're looking at these, remember the real ark looks like this, not like the boat with all the animals. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. So if we translate that into feet, we get 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now a cubit at the time was the distance from the ruler's tip of his finger to his elbow. Okay? Now mine would be a short cubit, but typically about 18 inches, okay? 18 to 20, somewhere in that. And I don't remember exactly what they used for this conversion, but that would be about the length of a cubit. So if we want to try to get a concept of how big the ark was, think of the length of the ark as being from this back wall back here on the stage all the way to the lot line where the fence is on the west end of the church. About 1.5 times the width of the church, and as tall, its height was from like this floor to the tip of the roof on the church. That's how big the ark is. So if you haven't seen the ark at the Ark Encounter, that's how you can visualize it. It's a huge wooden structure. Excuse me just a second here, we've got a technical issue. My computer's been giving me a little problem, and I'm going to have to restart PowerPoint. Apologize.
Judy, I love the commercial on TV of
Isn't that a great commercial?
With
Yeah.
the cute giraffes going up. And,
Yeah.
and even that is not very accurate.
Yep. I love the way the father giraffe faints at the end.
Yes,
It's
yes.
wonderful.
Also,
Okay, so Noah's Ark was about 1.5 football fields long. It had a length to width ratio of about 6 to 1. It's not coincidental that that is the most seaworthy ratio, and ships today still use it. So God knew what he was talking about when he gave Noah the instructions. It wasn't designed to go anywhere. It didn't have any navigation. It didn't have any steering. It was just designed to float on the floodwaters. It had a volume of about 1.5 million cubic feet and 100,000 square feet of floor space. Just gigantic. So it had storage space equal to 522 railroad cars. Can you imagine? So one of the other questions that comes up quite often is, how could Noah fit all the creatures on the ark? We think of all the different species that we have in the world today, and it just seems like an overwhelming number of animals on the ark, doesn't it? But Not all living creatures had to go on the ark. Only the birds and land-dwelling creatures with the breath of life had to go on the ark. So, for example, any sea creatures were going to be able to survive in the sea. Some of the insects definitely did not have to go on the ark. And that's kind of surprising sometimes. You'd like to think that maybe the insects were on the ark and Noah could have just gotten those 2 mosquitoes, saved us a lot of trouble. But the insects didn't have to go because they can survive on. Can you imagine all the debris that was floating around when the destruction happened? All these trees, all this vegetation was probably floating on top of the water. So they can survive there. And some insects in their larval state can even survive in water. So there was no command to take the insects. So that cuts down on about 80% of the species that would have to be on the ark. Only 2 of each kind went on the ark. Now we should talk about what kind means. Are any of you familiar with the taxonomic nomenclature? I can't remember what it starts now. Domain, I think, or something like that. But it goes down. Well, toward the end, there's family, and then there's, I think, genus and species. So this kind is kind of at this family level. So it's not every single species, but it's up a couple of levels. And usually the deciding factor on what things are the same kind are whether they can interbreed. Okay? So, for example, there would be a cat kind, and all the cats would belong to that, even like tigers and leopards and lions, right? So they would all be of the same kind, so you only had to have one of those. And they had enough genetic variability that after the flood, they were able to produce all the different cats that we see today, the cat species that we see today. So the same would be true of dogs and horses. The zebra would be part of the horse kind, for example. Does that make sense? So they didn't have to take 2 of every species. They had to take 2 of every kind. And there were special instructions for clean animals, animals that they were going to sacrifice. So 7 of every clean animal. Okay, so he said sea creatures and insects were not on the ark. We can assume, if we calculate that out, then the creation scientists have said, well, there'd probably be a maximum of 50,000 creatures that would have to go on the ark. And we really think the number's much smaller than that. It's probably closer to like 16 to 20,000. So the average size animal on the ark was about the size of a sheep. And we go, okay, well, what about the dinosaurs? Did they go on the ark? Well, they did. But do you know what the largest dinosaur egg is that we've ever found? It's about the size of a football. And dinosaurs, scientists have found, don't grow very fast in their first 7 years of life. And I asked one of the scientists how they knew that. He said, well, bones have layers just like trees have rings. And so they could count the number of layers in the bones. And they believed that they really didn't start to grow until they were more than 7 years old. So only young creatures needed to be on the ark. Why would we prefer young creatures on the ark? Why would Noah prefer young creatures on the ark?
Smaller.
They're smaller.
They had to go out and breed.
That's right, they had to breed. So we don't want grandpas and grandmas on the ark. We want young animals on the ark.
No grandpas and grandmas on the ark.
So what that does then is it gives us even more space in the ark. So the average railroad car can accommodate about 240 sheep. So a train pulling 210 cars could carry 50,400 sheep. We take 210. Yes, Arvin?
And get an idea of 210 cars. You've seen the coal trains like between here and Colorado Springs and so forth. Those coal trains, and you see how long they are usually 100 to 110 cars per train. So 210 would be 2 of those trains in the end.
It'd be huge, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we've got 210 of the 522 cars full, then there were 312 cars still available for Noah and his family, plus food and luggage. So they really had plenty of room on the ark. And I think if you ever get a chance, go see the ark in Kentucky, because you'll be able to see how they really did have a lot of room in that ark. There was really plenty of room for all the animals. Okay, so we've got the ark built. We've got the animals loaded. God says, Noah, get in the ark, right? And he closes the door. God closed the door himself. And then what happened? Well, not right away. They sat there for 7 days. Nothing happened. Well, what would you be thinking if you were sitting in an ark that you had spent 100 years building, you had all these animals, and God closes the door and nothing happens? Takes a lot of faith, doesn't it? Noah had a lot of faith. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened. So most people, like I said before, picture the flood coming down. We think of the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. But how does the Bible really say the flood started? It says the fountains of the great deep burst forth, doesn't it? Actually, fountains of the great deep were the first sign of trouble. Scientists believe that they were actually the seafloor splitting apart, and lava and steam would have been pouring out of those cracks. Okay? Let's do an artist's conception of what the beginning of the flood would have been like. This is from Answers in Genesis. Picture of the beginning of the flood than maybe what you've had? How'd you like to be on that ark when that wave hit? Think you would have got bounced around a little bit. Or maybe see it coming and knowing that you had no protection at all. You know, the Bible never mentions the people who weren't on the ark, or how they felt or what they thought. I guess the time for God's grace was over and it was judgment, just like someday it will be for us as well. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So that's about 20 feet above the mountains. Again, they refer to mountains here, but don't think of the real high mountain ranges that we have now, the Rockies, the Himalayas, the Andes. Those were formed toward the end of the flood, so they weren't there yet. When they talk about mountains, the Bible's really referring to probably high hills. Okay. Here's just a little chronology of the flood. In the 600th year, the second month, the 10th day, Noah and his family entered the ark. So the elapsed time was 0, and we have the biblical references up there in that last column. We're not going to go through every one of those. But then on the 10th day, Noah and his family entered the ark. On the 17th day, the flood begins. So they've been in the ark for 7 days. And then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. So by the time the rain finished, they were at day 47 on the ark. Then the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. They covered the high mountains, for more than 22 feet deep. So that's going on for 150 days. So at day 157, the ark finally rests on the mountains of Ararat. And notice it doesn't say Mount Ararat, it says the mountains of Ararat. We don't know exactly where the ark is, though a lot of people have looked for it. And we've been kind of stymied in our quest to find the ark because these mountains are in Turkey and in the Islamic countries where people have a rough time, trying to go and look for stuff. So that's search for the ark has kind of been on hold for the past few years. The tops of the mountains were then not even visible then, so obviously the ark was caught on a high mountain. It wasn't until day 31 that they actually could see the tops of the other surrounding mountains. And then on day 71, or 271, Noah sent out a raven and a dove. And then they waited another 2 weeks. On day 285, Noah sent out 2 more doves, or during that time period. But it was actually by day 321 that the water dried up, and Noah could remove the covering of the ark. And on day 377, Noah and his family disembarked from the ark. So they were actually in the ark for more than a year. The duration of the flood was just a little bit over a year, but remember they were in the 7 days before the flood started. So that's just kind of an overview. Let's look at what happened to the earth during this period of time, okay? These lines that you see here are where we believe the fountains of the Great Deep broke open. And today we still see them in the ocean. They're called mid-oceanic ridges. So they're still there. We see the scars. And each of these areas is called a plate. This is the South American plate. There's an African plate. There's a Pacific plate. Scientists believe, that, and this is both secular and creation scientists, believe that those plates, there was originally one continent on the earth called Pangaea, or some refer to it as Rodinia, that during the beginning of the flood, when the fountains of the Great Deep split the seafloors, that continent began to break up, and it became the 7 continents that we have today. And they moved over a period of months into the positions that they have today. So they were moving, when they broke up, at about 10 plus feet per second, and they were traveling at highway speeds across the crust of the earth. And as they were doing that, this seafloor was being sucked down into the mantle of the earth and replaced with new seafloor. So that's how come they could move. And as they moved across the face of the earth, eventually they began to collide. So let's take a look at what that would look like with that continent breaking up. It's the continent of Pangaea. Now you see it start to separate into the continents that we know today. And watch India here. India is coming up to hit Asia. And they believe that India slipped under Asia, and that's what caused the Himalayas to form. And over on the west side of North and South America, that plate, the North American and the South American plates, they ran into the Pacific plate. And the Pacific plate went underneath the North American and South American plates and raced up the Rockies and the Andes. Now, when those two collided, and when all these collisions were happening, can you imagine what the water was doing? There was tsunami after tsunami after tsunami. And as the water rolled in for these tsunamis, they're saying probably one tsunami every 30 minutes to an hour. Okay? Remember the tsunamis that we saw in Southeast Asia? They were nothing compared to these tsunamis. Because you have to remember, as all this is happening, the Earth is also still rotating, right? And the moon is still out there, so we still have tides going on. So the forces, it was like shaking a bathtub full of water, right? And this water is going every direction. And it's carrying with it sediment. And as it comes in, it's got the sediment, it's rolling very fast, so it brings the sediment in over the land. And then as it starts to back out, it's going slower and slower. And so what happens to water when it slows down? It drops anything that's suspended in it, right? And so we see sedimentary layers starting to form. And that's what we saw in that one picture, and we see it again. So as these sedimentary layers are forming, what's happening to the animals? They're getting caught, aren't they, in the sedimentary layers, and they're getting buried. So probably first the sea creatures, and as those tsunamis roll in, the sea creatures get tossed up over the land. And then the next thing that happens is those creatures that lived near the shore of the continent, they get tossed up over top of them. And then the creatures that are a little bigger, maybe that live a little further away, get piled on top of them. And then eventually the dinosaurs and the mammals, because the mammals could move a little bit faster, and then eventually on top of that, humans, because humans were intelligent, they knew how to get away from it, they could climb, so they could move. So when those plates came together, crashed together, picture the Pacific plate going under the North American plate. Think about the friction there and how much heat you would get out of that. It generated humongous volcanoes. Okay, we think of Mount St. Helens or Vesuvius or any of those volcanoes that we see today, and we think they were pretty big volcanoes. These were hundreds and thousands of times bigger than those volcanoes. Generated earthquakes, generated tsunamis. And you see a picture of the formation of mountains here. And what do you see? You see these curved layers of rock? Those are sedimentary rocks. So as that Pacific plate went under North America, it started shoving, right? It just piled them up like an accordion. Now, let me ask you this. Can you curve a rock? Who can do that? Can you curve a rock? Anybody can do that? Okay, which is a good reason. You look at all these curves, right? So that tells us that these mountains had to be formed when all these layers of sediment were still soft and warm. Okay? Now, secular scientists would say that these took millions of years to form. Okay? I don't think so, because there's no erosion between these layers. They're right on top of each other. And they had to be soft when they were pushed into that position. They'd have been hard, we'd see them crack and become boulders, right? So, yes, Chuck?
Yeah, a local example of that is Castle Rock. There's a display downtown in Castle Rock in their old Central Park talking about the little buttes there and saying, well, this butte came from the Collegiate Peaks 100 miles away.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We have just amazing stuff around this area. I mean, you can go down to Colorado Springs and you can see the Great Unconformity, which is where it's kind of the boundary between the creation rock and the flood rock. You can see that down at Cave of the Winds.
Yes.
You've got red rocks, where a lot of the rocks were lifted up because we're living right on a fault line here where the plains from the east went under the mountains and also pushed them up from this side. We've got dinosaur, or fossil ridge out here that has dinosaur fossils. And so we've got a lot of stuff in this area. It's amazing. Well, there are two views of the flood. The first is the Christian worldview, which is what we've been talking about right now. That the flood was global, covered the entire earth with water. It was catastrophic. Didn't happen over long periods of time with slow processes. It was catastrophic when it happened. And that the geological layers, so all those layers of sediment that we see if we drive through the mountains, that we see if we cross the Midwest, all those were laid down within 1 year, okay, according to the biblical worldview. And that fossils were buried during the flood in the order of their death. So as I was talking about, they came in, the sea animals came first, and then those near the shore, and then the larger animals, the dinosaurs, the mammals, the humans. And so they were buried in that order. There's another worldview, and this is called the humanistic worldview. And this is the worldview that people have, usually who don't believe in God. There are some old earth Christians that do believe some of this as well. But if they believe in old ages, typically they believe that the flood was local. They believe the earth is old, they believe that the flood was local. And we're going to understand why that's the case. They believe in uniformitarianism. Now that's a big term. It's kind of like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, right? But what it really means is that everything just happened through long periods of time, slowly over millions and billions of years. They believe the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. The geological layers occurred over millions of years. So those came in, they formed, I don't even know how they think they formed, but one on top of each other, but over millions of years. And that fossils evolved. Well, animals evolved, fossils don't evolve, but animals evolved and died over millions of years, and they were buried as those layers formed over millions of years. Okay? So that's really the difference between the two worldviews, between what the Bible says and what our schools and our culture teaches as evolutionary teaching. So what's the difference? What difference does it make if we believe in one or the other of those worldviews? Well, let's put a timeline here, and let's say we have creation at the beginning. This is the biblical worldview. We have creation at the beginning, and at the end God said it was very good, right? So God's very good is perfect. And then we have Adam and Eve created, and they fall into sin. And their sin results in death. But look at now the humanistic worldview. We have creation, and then we have millions of years, or maybe billions of years. We have Adam and Eve, maybe coming from apes, right? Maybe evolving. And then we have Adam and Eve sinning. What's going on here? Death, right. Because if you believe in evolution, then it's survival of the fittest, right? So somebody had to die. So we've got death and disease and suffering going on here. So what is death now related to? It's not related to sin anymore, is it? There's no effect from the fall. Absolutely no effect. So why did Jesus go to the cross, if that's true? So you see, it does relate to the gospel. There was no need for a savior if sin is not related, if death is not related to sin. If death is just related to long time periods, then why do we have a savior? So was it a global flood? Well, what does the Bible say? The Bible says, it uses terms that refer to a global flood. It uses a lot of different terms. The term the earth uses that over 40 times in the flood narrative, and it doesn't appear with any accompanying limitation. I will destroy them with the earth. Everything that is on the earth shall die. It also uses the term all flesh, and that occurs 12 times in Genesis 6 through 9. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. And then the expression, every living thing, it's another expression of totality. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort onto the ark. I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. There's also the phrase, under the whole heaven, and that's used 6 times in the Old Testament, outside of the flood narrative, and always has a universal meaning. It usually refers to the universe, to the entire universe. And then here's some questions. If the flood was a local flood, then why did Noah have to build an ark, right? He could have just gone over the mountains and lived somewhere else. Just like God told Lot when he was in Sodom, I'm going to destroy Sodom, so get out, right? He wouldn't have needed an ark. Why did God bring the animals to the ark? And why would the ark have to be so big? And why would even birds have to be on the ark? Obviously, they could fly somewhere else and take care of themselves. And then there's also the level of water, right? Because it says the water reached 20 feet over the highest mountains. So water kind of finds its own level. I don't think it's going to stop just because it reaches the top of the highest mountains, right? And then there's God's promise. God promised that he would never again send another flood like Noah's flood to destroy the earth, didn't he? If Noah's flood were a local flood, would God have kept his promise? No, God would be a liar, right? And we know that God's not a liar. So if God wanted us to understand that this was a worldwide flood, do you think he could have made it any clearer? It's pretty clear he's saying the whole world, isn't it? So what evidence do we see today for the flood? Well, there's a lot of it. What evidence would you expect to see if there was a massive worldwide flood? What would you expect to find? If you've heard Ken Ham, you know what the answer is, right? billions of dead things, right? Laid down all over the earth and sediments that were laid down by water. Now, that isn't exactly the way he says it, but he's got a phrase there that he always uses. So what do we find? That's exactly what we find. We also have a very good example of what happened in Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens in Washington State was a volcano that erupted on May 18, 1980. And this is what it looked like beforehand. And it provides creationists with a very good laboratory to study what happened, and it provides us with an example similar to the Grand Canyon, so we can compare what happened at Mount St. Helens with what happened at the Grand Canyon, and we can look at whether it really takes long periods of time to make some of these things happen. Okay, so here's Mount St. Helens after the eruption. Quite a difference, isn't it? You can see the dome at the top. It kind of blew the side off the mountain, the north side off the mountain. Jim and I were privileged to go up there this summer and to take a tour of Mount St. Helens, and it's pretty amazing. The destruction is just absolutely amazing. But this top blew off, and when it blew off, you'll see this is a lake down here called Spirit Lake, and it's right up there where that arrow's pointing. And when that blast happened, it was the equivalent of 1,600 nuclear bombs like we dropped on Hiroshima. Okay. So the debris that came off that mountain came into Spirit Lake, and the actual blast blew the water out of Spirit Lake. It went up, the debris came down from the mountain, filled in Spirit Lake, and Spirit Lake is now 300 feet higher than it was prior to. It's amazing. And this is the surface of Spirit Lake now. 4 million logs ended up in Spirit Lake. This is what it looks like today, 40 years later. And you can still see the logs floating on top of Spirit Lake. That's how big the catastrophe was. The trees that were within 7 miles of the blast, they were all flattened. And they were all flattened in exactly the same direction. You look out there and they're just laying parallel to each other, all pointing away from the blast. The ones from 7 to 14 miles are still standing, but they're burned to a crisp. They just look like logs standing up. So out to 14 miles, that blast destroyed pretty much everything in sight. And you think of Mount St. Helens as being a small volcano. It also deposited up to 600 feet of sediment. And this is what they call the Little Grand Canyon now, because it resembles the Grand Canyon. It's the Little Grand Canyon of the Tula River. And it was eroded in one day. So the sediment came down, and then the ash and the steam and everything formed the river, flowed down through there, and eroded that in one day. It also, you can see the sedimentary layers, and these are very similar to sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon, and those sedimentary layers are also found around the world. Again, those were created in one day. So it's great proof to us, a great affirmation of the Bible that we don't need long ages for all these geological occurrences to take place. So we've talked a lot about sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock usually consists of mud, sand, or gravel. It's rock that was caught up by water and then it was deposited somewhere, all right? As opposed to rock that came from a volcano. That's called igneous rock. Okay. Sedimentary rocks include like sandstones, shales, and limestones. And as we saw at Mount St. Helens, long periods of time are not required to harden the rock. Here's some interesting things that we found. Here's a clock buried in sedimentary rock that's supposed to be millions of years old. Here's keys, same thing, buried in sedimentary rock that supposedly is millions of years old. And a spark plug. You think they made cars millions of years ago? You think so? And again, we come back to the curved rock layers. We talked about whether solid rock can curve. That's another great evidence that this was a catastrophic event that occurred over a very short time period. Then we have an ice age. Now, secular scientists believe in multiple ice ages, but when you think about what they do with slow gradual processes, there's really no way you get an ice age to form. The Bible, at the end of the flood, the biblical worldview would have reasons for an ice age. We talked about how the continents were moving and how this caused volcanic action. Well, that would have heated up the oceans, right? And so we have hot oceans, so we have water evaporating from those oceans going up into the atmosphere. And then the continents are cooler. Okay, they're not quite as warm as the ocean because they've been warmed up by the volcanic action. Now we have volcanoes on the land also, but they didn't have the effect of warming up the land as much as the water. So we have the evaporation going up, and then we also have all these volcanoes spewing stuff out into the atmosphere. And what happens when our atmosphere gets a bunch of particles in it?
Cloudy.
It's cloudy, and it reflects the sunlight. And so what does that do? It cools off everything underneath it. So again, we have cold land, we have warm oceans. So this is going up as water, as steam, and it's coming back down as snow. And so the perfect conditions existed for an ice age to form. So we have cool continents, we had cooler summers because of the particulates in the atmosphere. And so what happened? Yes, Chuck?
Yeah, there's an example of that in 1830 when Krakatoa exploded. There was no summer in New England.
Right, right. It really does make a difference. And when Mount St. Helens exploded, I think Spokane, which is 250 miles to the east, they couldn't see anything. It was night for like 24 hours. So it was amazing. But these cooler summers then caused ice to form, and as the ice formed, the ocean levels dropped, right? And what happened then was that land bridges appeared. And so the question always comes up, well, if all these people were, at the site of where the ark landed, how did they get scattered all over the world? Well, this is probably when it happened. Probably this happened, this was happening at the end of the flood, and if you remember the Tower of Babel, that's about 100 years after the flood when God scattered all the people according to language. So they probably crossed these land bridges, which were there at the time, to get to the various continents again. Okay, and we mentioned fossils. What is a fossil? It's just any preserved remains of an animal or a plant. It could be a plant also. Organisms have to be buried rapidly in order to become fossils. If you have a bird or a mouse or some other creature die in your backyard, it doesn't automatically become a fossil, does it? No, because it decays, the oxygen gets to it, and you have predators that come and eat it, and so it just gets destroyed. It doesn't become a fossil. So what it takes to form a fossil is that things have to be buried very quickly, so they're away from oxygen, they're away from predators. Look at the evidence here that this happened very quickly. Here's a fish. When it was buried, can you tell what it was doing?
Eating.
Eating. It was eating another fish. Here's an ichthyosaur. You know what it was doing when it was buried? It was having a baby ichthyosaur. So you can tell that these were not events that happened over millions of years, right? They were events that happened very, very quickly. This may seem kind of confusing, and don't worry if you don't get all the detail on this. But this is the geology. It's a map of geological layers, okay? And so we start down here with Earth forming, and they've got it at 4.6 billion years. And then they've got these layers stacked on top of each other, right, as they form over millions and millions of years. And they've got the millions of years along the side here. Okay, so this is what is in all of our textbooks in school. So how do they determine time here? Well, this is all mostly sedimentary rock. Now, there might be some volcanic rock mixed with it, but it's mostly sedimentary rock. We always talk about radiometric dating and how that shows us how old the Earth is. You can't radiometric date sedimentary rock. You can only use radiometric dating on volcanic rock. So they've got a problem here. So what they really use is relative dating, because this layer is on top of this layer, it must be newer. Okay, and then this one must be newer than that one, and so forth, right? And then over here on this side, you see the animals that they find in these layers. And so down here you have little things called trilobites, invertebrates, very simple animals, mostly sea creatures. And then as you go up, you start to see more complex creatures, you get to dinosaurs, you get to mammals, and you get to humans on the top. Does this sound familiar? That's what we were just talking about, right? So, as these things show up in the layers, secular scientists would say, well, that's when they lived, right? And trilobites only live for a short period of time, or this particular fish only lived for a short period of time. And so we always find it in this layer, so that must be when it lived. Okay, and then they talk about how these animals evolved as they're going up the chain. Okay? Well, that's a little different than if you have the concept of the flood, right? Because if you have a concept, you have the Christian concept of the flood, you have these layers being laid down on top of each other almost immediately, within hours, right? And you have animals buried in the order in which they died, not the order in which they lived. And so the flood is great evidence. It's probably the best evidence we have that the earth is young and that evolution did not ever occur, right? Because all these animals were buried so quickly. Now, do you kind of see why it's important to evolutionists that we had a local flood and not a global flood? Yeah, because a global flood destroys evolution. So the dating of rocks, I just do a real simple thing here. Looking at that diagram that we just looked at, how do you know the age of the layer of the rock? Well, the way scientists determine that is, they say, well, we usually find these fossils in these rocks. So if we find a fossil here, then that must determine the age of the rock. They're called index fossils. So they know the age of the sedimentary layer by the index fossils found in the layer. Well, how do we know the age of the fossil? By the rock that it's found in. So do we know anything? No. We just have a bunch of circular reasoning, okay? And sometimes these fossils are found in layers that they're not supposed to be found in. And that really confuses the evolutionists because they're not supposed to be alive in that other level, right? But they're frequently found there, especially sea creatures. They're found all the way up, and they're also found on the highest mountains. We know that Mount Everest was once underwater because we see evidence of sea creatures fossilized on Mount Everest, right? So those are found throughout the entire geologic column. Some other evidence we have from the flood. We have what's called living fossils. So these fossils are fish, in this case, a coelacanth fish, and everybody thought that it was extinct, that it had died out 80 million years ago. And then guess what happened? They found one. In 1938, they found one, and it had not changed over 80 million years. Okay? So what does that say about evolution? And we have lots of other examples. This is an elephant shark. Again, supposedly died out 420 million years ago. No change between elephant sharks today and elephant sharks then. Same thing with crocodiles. No change in 55 million years. Okay, so these are, again, great evidence of the flood and of the fact that our Earth is young. And then if evolution is true, we should see some transitions, right? We should find some fossils that were in the process of changing from one thing to another when they were buried, right? So, and some of these should be pretty amazing because, you know, fish had to evolve into land animals, so they had to grow legs, right? So we should see a fish growing legs. They claim that dinosaurs turned into birds, so maybe we should see them developing feathers and wings somewhere. Maybe one of them died and was buried when he was trying to create wings. Well, we don't see too many of these. You ever seen one of these? Or how about a bunny cat? Or a rhino melon? A bird dog? Not what we think of when we think of a bird dog. A sparrow boxer? Here's an improved polar bear. He's got 6 legs. And this one is commonly found in churches. We have found this one. You know what it is? It's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? And here's a cat shark, or a controlla. And these are funny, and we laugh at them, but really we have not found any transitional fossils that would indicate that one animal turned into another. Yeah, and if you look at Google, if you Google transitional fossils, you will find a list of them. But most of them have been hoaxes, or they have been mistakes. For example, there's some that have been found in China where they put together feathers in a dinosaur and made a fossil out of it. So there's lots of examples of that. But I don't know of one that's been proven to be true. Let's talk about dinosaurs in time. So dinosaurs claim to have lived 65 to 220 million years ago. And again, remember that circular reasoning? Dinosaurs are dated by the rocks that they're found in. And dinosaurs are used usually as classic proof of evolution in long ages. They're what is called index fossils, so if you find a dinosaur, you know how old the rock is, right? So if there were evidence that dinosaurs lived only a few thousand years ago, and then what would that do to the assumptions that they've made in dating these rocks and fossils? It would pretty much destroy that evidence, wouldn't it, those theories. Well, guess what? Since the 1990s, scientists have discovered soft tissue in dinosaur bones. And this is a picture of the soft tissue. So it's stretchy tissue. It's tissue that hasn't fossilized, and you can take it. I had one of the scientists who came who showed us a movie of how they could stretch that tissue, okay, in a fossil. So there's soft tissue in dinosaur bones. That does not last millions of years. They found unfossilized dinosaur bones, so they've actually found the bone where it hasn't been turned to stone yet. They found proteins, they found red blood cells, and they found DNA in dinosaurs. Now these kinds of soft tissue have very short lives. They do not exist, probably not even for thousands of years, let alone millions of years. They've also found carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. And carbon-14, you hear it a lot of times because they say, oh, carbon-14 dates the age of the Earth. This makes it really old. Wrong. Carbon-14 is only found in living creatures, first of all. And secondly, it has a very short half-life. I think it's about 5,640 years. It's very short. So anything older than 80,000 years should have no carbon-14 at all in it. And yet we found significant amounts of carbon-14 in the dinosaurs. So we know that without a doubt, they were not millions of years old. Dinosaurs and people lived at the same time, just like the Bible says. They were created on day 6. They were land animals. What happened to them? Again, the evolutionists would say they turned into birds. They died out. We don't know how they died. But something caused them to die. It could have been they were hunted, it could have been environmental changes, whatever. But they went extinct. For them to become birds, basically every major structure and system within the dinosaur would have had to be changed. And there's no way that those could have changed in the way that they would have survived it. So if you hear that dinosaurs turned into birds, don't believe it. Okay, again we said, okay, if we had a flood, there would be lots of evidence because there would be all these dead things buried in the layers, right? And that's exactly what we find. Fossil graveyards are found throughout the world. They present a major challenge to evolutionists. And here's just a few examples. I'll go through them quickly. Agate Springs, Nevada. We have 9,000 animals, and it's a variety of animals. Rhinos, horses, camels, fish, seashells. So from all different environments. In Alaska and Siberia, we again have a real mix of animals. Some of them are not native to cold environments, right? Here's Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. Again, this is fairly close to us. It's one of the largest fossil graveyards in the world. They have over 1,600 individual bones, 11 species of dinosaurs, and several complete skeletons. And do you know what the most common fossil is at Dinosaur Ridge? You would think, wouldn't you? No. Sea fossils. Okay? Sea fossils mixed with the dinosaurs. And the Grand Canyon. Again, billions of straight-shelled chambered monolites. They're found fossilized and all pointing in the same direction, by the way. These are sea creatures. The Grand Canyon is a mile above sea level. So do you think that at one time the floodwaters were covering the Grand Canyon? I'd say it's a pretty good bet. Okay. So what can we draw from the flood? conclusions can we do? Well, God used the flood to cleanse the world of sin, right? He told us that. We can see that the flood was global and it was catastrophic. Huge amount of damage and destruction. It lasted about a year, and the flood accounts for the multiple sedimentary rock layers that we see and the fossil record, all the dead things buried in those layers. Only 8 people survived it: Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. It resulted in a single ice age, not multiple ice ages. And there are many legends that exist about a flood, probably carried with people groups. After the Tower of Babel, God dispersed those people groups. They carried with them legends about the flood, and eventually they got distorted, right? The Bible's the only correct version of the flood. But you find references to Noah, you find references to boats with 8 people on them, and you find just all kinds of references in all of these other cultures to the flood. So the flood provides significant evidence that the earth is young as the Bible says it is. So what connections can we draw? Well, there are parallels that we can draw. Just as the ark was salvation for Noah and his family, so Jesus is our salvation, right? And the church is also pictured as an ark. And it has, in a lot of churches, in fact, Ascension is one of them. If you go upstairs in the sanctuary, what do you see? You see these big arches, right? And so if you look up, it's like looking at the bottom of a ship, at the belly of a ship, right? Those arches are there to help us remember the flood. I didn't realize that until I really started studying it, but it makes sense. That's built into the architecture of our churches. And just as the floodwaters washed away sin and evil from the earth, so the waters of baptism wash away our sin. And the flood's a picture or a preview of the final judgment. See if I can read this right this time. As in the days of Noah, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Got pretty close that time. Okay, so let's look at the parallels between Noah's flood and the final judgment. The pre-flood world became increasingly wicked, didn't it? What's happening to our world today? The same thing. God predicts he'll destroy the world by water through the flood, and he predicts that he will destroy our world with fire at the end, doesn't he? God's always gracious, and he gives a warning. He gave the people of the pre-flood world 120 years, during which Noah preached to them. And then he gave even a final 7-day warning because he kept the ark there for 7 days before he sent the floodwaters, didn't he? And we've had a warning too. We've had over 2,000 years of the church preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. So he's been very gracious to us. Well, the ark provides the means to escape judgment. Only the people that were on the ark survived. And Jesus provides the means for us to escape judgment. If we believe in Jesus, we're saved. Noah and his family were saved from the flood. And all believers will be saved. And the judgment of the flood caused a reshaping of the entire earth. If you remember, the Bible says that during creation, water covered the earth. That's in Genesis 1:2. Well, in the flood, the water again covered the earth. So it's a symbol of a new start, a new creation. In the end, judgment causes the earth to be destroyed and a new heaven and a new earth are created. So those are the things that I think we can learn from the flood, that we can hopefully use to strengthen our faith and make us better able to defend ourselves in this kind of a culture that we live. So thank you again for inviting me today. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions?
Pardon?
I think it's interesting, you know, the idea of one large earth mass before the flood, and all the people on it creating a problem. With the flood, the earth was separated, and then right after that we had the Tower of Babel, which separated the people to go into all these various parts of the earth after separation. But then they had the connections between the thing because of the Ice Age, so that the people could navigate from one to the other and so forth. So I think that put together makes quite a picture there just on the earth movement and what happened with the people.
It does. God planned everything. That wasn't a coincidence that those land bridges appeared just as people needed them to move around. Any other questions? Anything you'd like you have that's come up that you're not sure about?
Judy, I always think it's interesting when you speak. Tell us about how we're connected with Noah.
Okay, yes, actually I had that in here, but we were kind of running out of time. Let me bring it up. Okay, does everybody know what DNA is? It's a molecule that contains all the instructions for how to build us and how our bodies can fix themselves and so forth. Well, by looking at our DNA today, and by comparing our DNA to other people, and a lot of people now have gone to like Ancestry.com and other places where they get their DNA tested and they find out what's included in their DNA. Well, they built up databases of people, not connected with their names, but they build up a lot of data about people who have registered their DNA. And they can trace mutations back through generations, all right? And they can see who the ancestors of those people were. That's how they can tell you kind of where you came from. And there's some limitations to that. But they use particular parts of the DNA. For example, in women they use what's called mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only passed from a woman to her daughters, not passed to men. So, and fathers, they use the Y chromosome, because Y chromosomes are only passed from father to son. And so they can trace those back. And they can even approximate the DNA sequences of Adam and Eve. They go to Noah, and then it's a little shakier from Noah back, because they don't have much information. This chart looks kind of complicated. What it's showing you, each one of these little lines, it looks like just a spider web, each one of those little lines shows the number of mutations and the type of mutations back to where they originally came from. Notice something here, there are 3 spots where they come together, aren't there? Don't look at this one because it actually comes from this group here, but there are 3 places where those all come together. Do you know who those people are? Wives. Yeah, this is the women. Okay, so all of us, it's what it's showing us is that all of us came from 3 women, the daughter-in-laws of Noah. Okay. Genetics is just an amazing science that is coming together to support what the Bible says. And if you look at the same kind of a tree of the Y chromosome, you'll find that they all come back to 1. There's only 1 Y chromosome in the whole world. It has mutations, but there's only 1 Y chromosome. And whose chromosome was that? Noah's. It could have come, we don't know where exactly it came from prior to Noah, but it was Noah's. And why was there only 1? Because all 3 of Noah's sons got his Y chromosome, didn't they? So that's why there's only 1 man and 3 women. Okay? Thanks, Athene. Bringing that up.
Judy, go back to the art, please. Because
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm and had to take care of waste.
Yes.
It sounds funny, I guess, but what on earth did they do with the waste?
Well, we have, let me just show you, this is part of a Bible study class that we put together. So what you're seeing today is about an hour out of about a 10 to 12 hour study that we have here. And one of the chapters...
My granddaughter has that.
Does she? Okay, we taught this in the Sunday school, junior high and high school last year. And so what they did was they developed systems so that, for example, and I should let Jim come up here and talk about this.
You're doing great, honey.
He kind of specialized in it. But they developed systems where they had like slides where the waste would go down the slides, it would get to the bottom, and then they would use moon pools to get rid of it. And a moon pool is like an enclosure in a ship where the water can come up and down as the ship goes. So it's like like a hole in the middle of a ship, but then it's enclosed so that the water can't come into the ship. And they could use things like that, and they would dump the waste in there, and then as the water went out, it would take the waste and so forth. And they had probably 2 main pools, one for doing that, another one for circulating the air in the air, because the air in there would get pretty stale, wouldn't it? So they would use that one as the sea would go up and down, and then it would pump air in to the ark and circulate it. And then they had perhaps had chutes. Again, this is speculation, but Answers in Genesis did a lot of research on this, and they found ways that they could have developed these systems using the tools and the things that they had on hand at the time. So they also would have used chutes to get food and water to the animals. So there were a lot of different things they had to think about because they had to keep those animals alive.
A lot of engineering.
A lot of engineering, absolutely. Yeah, they were intelligent people. There's no doubt about that. They had to be. They were made in the image of God, you know. So, and they had no genetic mutations at the beginning. Obviously, some occurred as they were going through the 1,600 years before the flood, but they were still pretty minimal. And so they would have had a lot of the creativity, but probably much more creative. They were probably much more intelligent than we are today, because we're burdened down by a bunch of mutations. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here. You've been a great audience. Thank you.